they are looking for tolerant, loyal, trusting, empathetic, compassionate people. And that's the target, on survivors' back.
Welcome to Women Winning Divorce, the podcast helping successful women navigate divorce with dignity so you can protect yourself, your children, and your assets. I'm Heather Quick, founding attorney at Florida Women's Law Group, where women win at life. This week, we had Sandra Brown on the show, and we had a great conversation about narcissistic abuse and the trauma that comes alongside it and how to spot these dangerous situations. I hope this episode is valuable to anyone who might be listening. Stay tuned for the full episode. Welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. Today, we have Sandra Brown joining us. Sandra is the founder of the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction in Public Pathology Education, author of multiple books, researcher, and clinical lecturer. Welcome to the show, Sandra.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm so excited to have you on the show. And for our listeners today, Sandra and I will be discussing her industry-leading research on narcissistic abuse, how to spot a dangerous man before getting involved, and how PTSD is related to narcissistic abuse. So this is going to be very informative, to say the least, Sandra. So I'd love for you to give me and our listeners just a little bit more about your journey to where you are now professionally and how you got there. Because what an amazing body of work you've done, and your book, so much stuff.
Well, I started off as a therapist, working with people who had personality disorders. Right out of grad school, I started a personality disorder clinic, and I don't know why I thought that was a good idea. Yeah.
I'm sure you figured that this will be fascinating. I can help so many people.
Yeah, I think I thought it would be, but of course, that's not what happened. But during the course of that, the people who had the personality disorders began bringing in their partners because their relationships are horrible.
Okay.
And they blamed the partner, of course. So they dragged them in sort of as the identified patient, and they're the problem. And it was during that time period, I was also trained in trauma, that I noticed the survivors' really high levels of trauma. And after about 12 years of working with people with personality disorders, flying all over the country, getting the latest, greatest training, nothing works great for long with them. And so I switched teams and I started working with the survivors, because I noticed what they didn't have was an understanding about the personality disorder and, their partner. And they were sitting around waiting for change in disorders that rarely change. And I thought, I can't really help people with personality disorders, but I can help the survivors through education and treatment.
And so since then, that's what you've been doing and really focusing your practice on and your research.
Yeah, 30 some years now.
Wow. Well, for some of our listeners, could you just tell them a little bit, what is a psychotherapist?
They're a counselor.
Okay.
Yeah, they're a mental health counselor. They're not a psychologist, or sort of a step below a psychologist. They have a master's degree, but they're a counselor.
And, what inspired you? So you had done obviously the personality disorders, and then, at least what I've seen from, I haven't read everything because you have so much great stuff out there, but, it looks like you really have focused a lot on the narcissistic abuse, and within those personality disorders. What really inspired you to go into that area?
Well, Actually, I had named sort of the field when I began it, because there wasn't one that, when I first started, pathological love relationships. And it's more than narcissism. It can
Okay.
be other disorders, um, borderline personality disorder, narcissism, antisocial personality disorder, or psychopathy. And actually, a lot of my early work was actually working with survivors of psychopaths. But as the understanding about this type of abuse got out there, it got nicknamed narcissistic abuse. But really, when we were working with survivors, they could have partners that have different varieties of personality disorders. And so, because there weren't many people, doing that or understanding that, people find you. So
Right.
it began really through a grassroots effort and sort of word of mouth. And then when the books came out, I was easier to find.
Now, did you know you were starting a whole world of research, treatment, and ideas at that time?
No, I mean, my goal was certainly to try to get the word out that personality disorders in partners are very harmful in relationships, and that a lot of the survivors come out of that with trauma. I was certainly trying to get that message out there. Did I think it would explode into, what it has become now, which is, an entire new genre of counseling and a new field? No, I didn't think that would happen, but I'm glad to see it.
Absolutely. Now, what is the difference between the narcissistic personality disorder and a psychopath?
Severity.
Okay.
A lot of survivors like to dig into the DSM and pull apart different disorders, whether it's narcissism or psychopaths or antisocial. And I try to keep the understanding of it broader.
Okay.
There's an umbrella of disorders that have low conscience, low remorse, low guilt, low empathy. And it can range, I call it like Baskin Robbins, 57 flavors. The difference between an antisocial or a narcissist or a psychopath uh, um, are some of the different flavors. But it's much easier in identification for people who aren't therapists to be able to look broader. We don't need to know they're a narcissist. What we
Right.
need to be able to recognize early on is when there is a lack of conscience or remorse, guilt, empathy, whether that means they're antisocial or a psychopath or a narcissist, doesn't really matter. The outcome to the person is trauma, no matter which disorder it is. So we try for easier identification to
Hmm.
keep a broader understanding. Unless you're into all that and want to read the diagnostic manual and figure out all the little differences between them. But really, on a continuum of pathology, the psychopath would be at the far end. A step down would be antisocial or the narcissist.
Hmm.
But the issue is that a lot of times they have more than one disorder. Psychopaths can have narcissism. Narcissists can have antisocial personality disorder.
Hmm.
And it just, makes them even more dangerous when they have more than one disorder going on.
I really appreciate that. The way you clarify that, because it's, these behaviors that you see. And again, you're treating the victim, the woman who was involved with that person. So which one they fit into isn't as important as the trauma that you have experienced and then healing from that.
Right. We're treating the same outcome in the survivor. 75% of them have PTSD. So it doesn't matter what their partner was, and a lot of times they don't know for sure. The partner was never diagnosed. We're not treating the partner. And it doesn't matter if they were a psychopath or a narcissist. The outcome in trauma is similar.
Now, I mean, this is a big question, but I know you can help me answer. Why are women attracted to narcissists and this, grouping of personality disorders?
Um, Usually they have two different backgrounds. It's often wrongly assumed that all of the survivors are trauma survivors from childhood. And we did the research with Purdue University. That is not true. A percentage of them have adverse childhood histories of trauma that sort of prepare them to normalize these types of behaviors, in the relationship. They already experienced it, they grew up in it. There aren't any red flags really, because that's what they have experienced over a long period of time. And then there is another group that had normal childhoods, that had normal parents, that were loved, that did get what they needed in childhood, and yet they still ended up in these relationships. So, first of all, anybody with this type of personality disorder and pathology are master manipulators. So they fly in under the radar of nearly everyone, including therapists, including professionals who work, in the field of pathology. We've all been duped. And that's their skill set. That's what they are really good at. So we're all at risk. But if you have an adverse childhood, that certainly sets you up for not catching red flags because you have normalized it. But this other group that didn't, that was, part of our study with Purdue, that our personality traits can be such that and have slight tweaks or elevations in certain traits in our personality that make us prone to more tolerance, more empathy, more compassion. Therapists wrongly call it codependency, that if you have any level of empathy or tolerance or compassion, that, it must be codependency. And what our study found is that a lot of them that didn't have adverse childhoods had trait elevations in these couple of personality traits. The trait, one of the traits is called the trait of agreeableness. And it's what pathological people target. They are looking for tolerant, loyal, trusting, empathetic, compassionate people. And that's the target, on survivors' back. And it's why they probably don't see the red flags coming. They have very high levels of trust, and tend to be very optimistic about human behavior. So if he screws up and is horrible, they are the people of 5,000 chances, because they believe, in growth and change. And the other trait is the trait of conscientiousness. And that is the trait why these relationships last so long.
Okay.
That they are very invested in the success of the relationship. They make really great employees, are very success driven. And so relationship failure is not on their dance card. In fact, they are poor. They don't fail well. So they will do nearly anything to not have that experience of failure. And honestly, other than this pathological relationship, they're very successful people. So they haven't had a lot of failure to know how to let go. And so these traits of their personality, but is both how they get into the relationship and then why it's so difficult to disengage.
Get out.
Yeah.
Now, you have a book called How to Spot a Dangerous Man. So, and of course, now I'm going to ask you, how do you spot him? And I know you have a whole book about it, but maybe some of the highlights, because I found that, very great title, but really interesting, because that's what women are looking. I mean, they say, oh, okay, well then tell me how am I going to spot him?
Right. So I wrote that book 19 years ago. I mean, it's still selling. I think it's a title.
Yes.
But if I was writing that book today, I wouldn't write it
Okay.
because I'm 19 years further
Yes.
into, this field and have realized, so much, and that it's not as easy. And I know we like easy answers. Give me 10 ways to spot a dangerous man. Shoot,
I know.
there.
Now I know, right? I can check them off.
Yeah,
Right.
this will never happen to me again. And so, there were 8 dangerous man types that did just that. It gave you external red flag signals.
Mm-hmm.
But it really isn't always that easy with that. And so I think our understanding about dangerous relationships has been better captured in our book that, came out afterwards, Women Who Love Psychopaths, which again is that broader view of pathology and looking for low conscience, remorse. It is the commonalities of pathology, that low empathy, the gaslighting. Those are really, I think, the bigger signals to someone's, potential pathology than it is whether or not they have a job. I mean, that's
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, that we've got to get better at communicating to people about what low conscience is, or when they have a lack of empathy or not enough guilt or remorse. And those are I think, the bigger concepts where all the pathology hides underneath.
Well, and I think I really appreciate that you said that, right? Because yeah, you are 19 years into the field and so much research that you have done and learned. But also, I mean, you need to be in a relationship for a substantial amount of time to really get to know someone.
Right.
So you might not be able to just check these off after a date because you're not going to see all that. How can you know somebody?
Well, you can't. And so sometimes it's best to look at as the survivors come out of the relationship and learn from their trauma and their symptoms that help us, connect the dots backwards. And so one of the really big symptoms of these survivors that caught my attention, that made me start researching them, is they were not like I was a trauma therapist. They weren't like my single sexual assault clients
Okay.
who had been, raped, maybe by a stranger or something. There was such a different thing going on, with them. And one of their symptoms is a symptom of cognitive dissonance. And that is something that makes me sit up as a therapist and take notice anytime that I see it in the survivor. And that takes time to develop. It develops over time in the relationships. And that's what I'm saying, working backwards and connecting the dots. When I see a survivor who has cognitive dissonance, which is they can't keep their mind set consistently on is he good? Is he bad? Do I love? Do I loathe? Do I trust? Do I distrust? That's dissonance. And that is created when you are in a relationship with a Jekyll and Hyde personality that has two different sides. So your brain is comparing and ping-ponging. I love, but I loathe. He did, he does these good things and he does these bad things. These survivors, 100% of them have that symptom of cognitive dissonance. Like rape survivors, you don't always see that in. They might not be in a relationship, with the person who assaulted them. But in this population, that's always, to me, sort of my first indicator they were in a pathological relationship. And so I think it's helpful for when we're talking about what is the big red flag, is when your thinking consistently becomes confused about, do I trust or distrust, want or not want this relationship, do I love or do I loathe? Those are bigger signs that you might be dealing with somebody with pathology, because that's what we see in these survivors 100% of the time. And so instead of telling them to, remember, 10 signs of narcissists or whatever, it's got to be themselves and internal, their own experience what is happening in their mind and in their brain from these relationships. And if women understood that quicker, they get out quicker. It's the only red flag they will ever need. That's why I don't teach red flags anymore. And unfortunately, you learn it best by horrible experiences. And, once they've been in a pathological relationship, the next time around, they will really be able to identify that dissonance in their thinking in the next, in the next relationship, for sure. If we taught it more often as a as sort of as a red flag, as the red flag, that when you can't get on the same page, because there are those cycles of intermittent reinforcement that he's good, he's bad, that set off the cognitive dissonance. When you start experiencing those kinds of symptoms, that's a really good indicator of pathology in the partner, and of that you are probably developing trauma as well.
And, how, I guess, I mean, I have so many questions, but when do women usually realize that they're married to somebody with, a personality disorder, that something is, going on? Because it seems as though some can be in these relationships for years and years.
Right. Well, again, because these kinds of disorders are a disorder of social hiding. They hide well.
Okay.
I've had clients married for 40 years, to them, and didn't get a clue of stuff going on, for decades into it. But so let's give credit where credit's due. That's their skill set. They hide well. Takes some, for some of them, it can take years to figure it out. But usually what happens is there's a breadcrumb. And
Okay.
yeah, she just gets a sense of something, or he's acting funny with his phone, or protective over his computer, whatever. And then usually the survivor engages in reconnaissance, and looking, why the behavior changed. And there's always a breadcrumb. There's always a thread that begins to unravel when there's a clue that they follow, that that usually is Pandora's box, whether it's infidelity or a whole, I had other people that were married for years to people who weren't who they said they were. They had another identity, and their name wasn't their name. They lived with them for 20 years. Yeah, so it could be a whole hidden life, another life of criminality, or lots of unclaimed children. Um, just and usually infidelity, drug use, all that kind of things. So something, begins to unravel where they do some reconnaissance, find something, the walk and talk don't match. It's not who they thought, and Pandora's box is open.
Now, how is domestic violence intertwined into narcissistic abuse and these types of pathological love relationships?
Well, the domestic violence field's gone through their own sort of changes there too, where they're leaning more into this understanding of coercive control. A lot of times that old word of domestic violence, we think of it as mostly physical violence.
Right.
Yeah, or maybe sexual violence. But it's broader than that. It's emotional, psychological, spiritual, financial, as well as physical and sexual.
Right.
And so any of that is, if you want to use that word, domestic violence. And so, people that have these types of pathological disorders, not all of them are violent. A large percentage of them are, but so much more of the harm that the survivors go through is, emotional and verbal abuse, but psychological,
Right.
abuse. And that's really where usually they develop the trauma, is from that. A lot of the gaslighting, even with the reconnaissance behavior, she finds something on the computer and they say, that wasn't on there. You didn't see that. And that's more of the, the psychological. But certainly, pathological relationships, or sort of, in my mind, that, out of a scale of 1 to 10, they're the 10 of coercive control, the most mind games, the most emotional, verbal, psychological, financial, spiritual abuse, even if there is not, physical violence.
Physical, right. And I in my experience, which I haven't certainly done as much research as you, of course, but I think for some women, and what they have told me over the years, is the physical violence is easy to identify. However, so much of the other abuse, it just didn't seem as clear. And I wasn't sure, the emotional abuse, the financial abuse, the control.
Yeah.
So they wonder, right? Because they question themselves. Is
Right.
this true? Is he this person or this person? Just like you said earlier. And I think, I mean, that's what I've heard, that, that made it harder, took me longer because
Right.
I just wasn't sure. I was like, is that really what I think it is? Am I overreacting?
Right. Yeah, it's much more insidious,
Yeah.
gaslighting. I've had clients who were hospitalized for losing touch with reality, that it was, so severe they couldn't tell what was real anymore. Often these pathological partners will go to really big extremes to keep their story hidden. And so it's an insidious form of abuse. Yeah,
Mhm.
give me a bruise. I know what happened.
Right.
But when you can't find out what is happening for months, years, or decades,
Mhm.
it just stays in your head, that you're crazy. Yeah, and you can't get to the facts, which is the reality.
Right.
And that's why these relationships can drag on for years and decades. Is women tend to be very fact oriented. They don't want to give up on a relationship. Show me proof. If
Yeah.
he's doing this or that, I'm out of here. And there's, such good hiders that information, those facts
Mhm.
could take, months or decades. And so very much a lot of what happens to them is psychological trauma,
Right.
and that's a big part of treatment.
Now, what is learned helplessness?
Yeah, so for those people, survivors who had early adverse childhood experiences, maybe it was pathological parents, maybe they were violent, mentally ill, addicts. Um, it's a learned role within the family. A lot of times, um, especially for instance, let's say in a family where the husband is an addict, that the mother, um, panders codependently to the addiction, trying to keep everything safe and walking
Mhm.
on eggshells. Well, the child growing up in that environment learns gender roles, they learn family roles by watching it.
Mhm.
And when there is no autonomy given to the mother or to the children, they learn levels of mandated almost dependency or a helplessness in their ability to make their own decisions. Um, or, a child can't leave the environment, but they grow up in that, watching that happen. And then patterns repeat, without treatment they will often repeat a lot of the dynamics that they grew up in. And so
Mm.
that's where sort of the learned helplessness comes in, when that they're being raised in a system that does not support autonomy. It punishes,
Okay.
autonomy and independence and critical thinking. And so, if that's what you're raised in, then you get another relationship like that, and um, those those patterns of learned helplessness can repeat.
Now, what is the connection to PTSD as well and brain damage when you've been subject to this? Which I don't know if it's correct to say narcissistic abuse or the pathological love relationship. Are they, I mean,
Yeah,
interchangeable?
they're interchangeable.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, well, one of the trauma studies that we did was on people coming out of pathological relationships. Um, and many of them had failed treatment. They kept going to counselors and support groups and stuff, but weren't really getting better because um, nobody was treating them for the trauma they had. They just weren't. People acted as if these weren't trauma survivors. So I did a study to look at why there was such high failed treatment rates in narcissistic abuse. And 75% of them come out of these relationships with PTSD or complex PTSD. So this is primarily a trauma population. But like I said before, their PTSD looks a little different. It doesn't look like a rape survivor looked like because of that cognitive dissonance. PTSD rewires the brain. It causes neuro problems. Cognitive dissonance also causes neuro problems. So these survivors who have both trauma and cognitive dissonance have even more neuro problems in brain functioning. So sometimes survivors say that, oh, I'm brain damaged. Well, I guess trauma is one way of looking at. I mean, when the nervous system and the brain does change, over time from trauma, it's not quite as bad as having a TBI, but it definitely ends up causing big changes in their ability to function. I've had survivors come out of these relationships and have to go on disability, go into neuro rehabilitation, see a neuropsychologist. It can, in some cases, get that bad, but the survivors definitely notice their neuro change. That some of them say things like, well, it feels like my IQ, like I lost 5 IQ points. My brain just doesn't work. And they're right. I mean, we now know, on a neuro level, what has happened to their brain, not just from PTSD, but also from cognitive dissonance. And so they're not crazy. They're not wrong.
Right.
Yes, there is a big neuro impact, and it's actually the longest part of treatment because we can treat trauma. Not that trauma treatment is really quick, but the neuro part for their brain to come back takes a little while, and it's some extra work with that.
And, how I just wonder, for a woman in this position and obviously suffering this trauma, how they are even able to leave and not go back, and where, what do you think there are some intervening events or something happens that really they were like, I got to get out of here, even if I do
Right.
feel like,
Yeah,
I'm going
of course,
crazy.
yes, sometimes it is when they finally get facts, when Pandora's box opens. That sometimes that's a leaving event for them.
Okay.
Show me the facts and I'm out of here. For others, not so much. A lot of the survivors have said it is the complete loss of the sense of self that made them leave when they couldn't find anything familiar inside it. And it is a complete breakdown and loss of sense of self. So sometimes they leave, when Pandora's box opens, and a lot of times, unfortunately, it is, further in the process where that lost sense of self. Of course, the earlier the better. The earlier the better, and that if women were in, but this is how women are wired too. If women understood more the concept of the whole relationship doesn't have to fall apart. I don't have to be in ultimate danger in order to call it quits. If they had a broader definition of what is dangerous to my well-being, you don't have to lift a fist. You don't have to do anything, but I can feel I'm not okay in this relationship. And that comes really early, usually earlier on in the relationship where they have that sense. The women are so driven by this, I'm not jumping ship unless you show me a fact, I'm not out of here. But we could be in much better shape if we left earlier, when we took our temperature, if you will, of our own well-being, that for whatever reason, that, whether you know all the facts or not, this relationship is not healthy for my own well-being. We would see a lot less trauma. We'd be treating a whole lot less trauma.
Now, how is your treatment and therapy different than other methods or anyone else's method?
Well, there hasn't been a method. That's what we studied in all the treatment failure. People just went to counselors. They told their story over and over again. Nobody figured out they had trauma because it looked a little bit different from dissonance. And they didn't get well. And so we created the first program, trauma treatment based, treating this kind of trauma, this PTSD with cognitive dissonance. And also incorporating the experiences that survivors have that have been in these types of relationships. It's different than just domestic violence. When you have a partner who has severe psychopathology, that in itself is pretty scary once you realize what you've been staring at and living with. And so our treatment approach, combines this type of trauma with this, cognitive dissonance, and then the personal experience of that partner's, the survivor's exposure to a partner's psychopathology, usually over decades. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, like, when we think of, Charlie Manson, right. And if somebody had lived with him for decades, not all of them are, serial killers, but we're talking about that same level of no conscience and remorse and all of that. What does that do to someone over decades?
Right.
Yeah, we have to assume big impact from that.
Now, you have something called the aftermath symptom questionnaire. What is that?
Um, that was sort of a nickname. When the field first started, that was a name a lot of people used, was the aftermath. Or they even nicknamed it after RAP.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really trauma symptoms. And we just went with what they were calling it at the time. But it is really a combination of trauma symptoms along with some of the side effects of having cognitive dissonance on top of it. Yeah. And so it's what we saw most frequently in these survivors.
Now, is narcissism and the abuse that comes along with it, and I mean, I know it's not a new problem because you've been studying this and treating people for so many years, but do you think now there is more focus on it, and or is it more prevalent?
Yeah. Both. First of all, it's, certainly from awareness, that survivors, and I think there's 800 websites now on narcissistic abuse, and 100 books or so. So certainly awareness. And I mean, it's like what we saw with autism. We didn't recognize that kids were just called slow, or over the generations they had different words for that. And then when autism came onto the public stage, we got better at identification, more research happened, we got better at treatment, all of that. So I think awareness has brought it up, but also our culture it continues to change, and I think we are more narcissistic. And I think we are traumatized in a lot of ways, especially since COVID. I don't know that we ever really came back from that. And it just does feel like there is a prevalence of sort of entitlement. And so there are some, in personality disorders, which isn't widely known, there are genetic elements to it. So some disorders transmit higher than others. For instance, anti-personality disorder transmits at 40%. So when we have children with people with certain disorders, yes, we are increasing the population within, in the country with that. So we could be seeing that. And I also think just the cultural changes now, people do seem much more entitled. And then there's a third category, which is everybody's a narcissist that we wrongly use. If somebody's, is mean to you, we call them a narcissist now. And that word is so thrown around that wrongly, that it's sort of diluted, that the importance of really understanding pathology, because we just call everybody a narcissist now. So while that word's out there, some of it is not being used correctly, and we're just hearing it more and more in our vernacular.
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier in the show that these usually these personality disorders, they're masters at hiding. And so there's there lots of professionals have been duped as well. Do you think that that may be more common in, say, when couples are trying to go to therapy, and maybe that particular therapist is not really trained in these areas, then that could happen more often, and they just say, oh, well, they have plenty of empathy, or they're fine, they're not a narcissist.
Absolutely. So we started working with an organization to develop certification for therapists in narcissistic abuse, because they missed it. We don't get this stuff in grad school. Well, first of all, when I was in grad school a million years ago, that concept, personality disorders, was around, but this concept of what happens in these relationships wasn't. So a lot of therapists haven't got it. And so, as a newer genre of counseling, we have definitely tried to do that, because therapists make big errors with this that could get the survivor killed. One is couples counseling, that it should
Right.
never be done.
Mhm.
And any therapist that works in couples counseling needs to have better training in personality disorders, so that she can identify it and cut off the counseling. You do
Mhm.
not want that, to keep couples, when there's personality disorders, in couples counseling. Women get killed that way.
Wow.
And so therapists need to be better identifiers, even if they're not going to specialize in personality disorders. And
Mhm.
if you work in any kind of relationships or trauma or domestic violence, you got to know it, because that's, that's their experience, and that's who's coming in through the door. And that's, a lot of the people who have taken this training and certification are couples therapists, so we're glad to see that. Trauma therapists, and a lot of people that work in DV, in
Mhm.
domestic violence. Yeah.
And, if you're a woman in this situation, say listening to this and it's resonating with them, and maybe they're trying to leave, when is the best time for them to get into therapy and seek
No,
help?
they just need to understand what can and can't happen in therapy when they are still in the relationship. So I
Mhm.
always like to be upfront, because I don't want to take people's money, that we're not going to be treating your trauma while you're still in the relationship getting traumatized. That's,
Mhm.
yeah, we can't do that. What can be done is give you support, and help you safety plan to get out.
Right.
These are slick, dangerous people. And so it definitely needs safety planning, especially in this population, not to just say, see ya, I pack my bags,
Mhm.
I'm gone. It takes more planning than that. So, you know, like I said before, getting out sooner is better, as far as your trauma, and as far as getting trauma treatment, because if you are actively, in that relationship, you're not out of trauma yet. So
Mhm.
real treatment can't go that deep.
Now, we're pretty much out of time, which the conversation went so quickly. Thank you, because it's so important to talk about it, and there's so much still to learn, and for me. But we are almost out of time. But since you are a trailblazer in the area, how do you see the field changing? Maybe in the next few years.
Mm, I hope we get more therapists. I mean, the predominant services or help out there is by other traumatized survivors. And while that's great, validation, support, that's
Hmm.
not trauma treatment. That's not everything
Right.
that can be done or should be done. They have a lot of support groups and stuff like that, but it's still not trauma treatment. We need more trauma therapists that are willing to get trained to do the deep work, not just the
Hmm.
surface work. Yeah.
Now, before we go, Sandra, can you impart on our listeners what you've learned about women and their resilience throughout your career and experience?
Hmm. Um, it always amazes me. Um, there is something to female resiliency. It is very different to me. It is very different than male, but what you see in men, and that's not to say men aren't resilient. There's a different flavor to it in women, which is what has kept me in. I'm doing
Right.
really, really hard work for 30 some years. It is that there's just the compellingness of um, the human spirit for healing. Um, Yeah. And it's a joy every time um, to help women, get to a better level of functioning. So yeah, it's what's kept me in.
Well, I'm so glad that you are in and so that you've done all that you have in this area of work. But lastly, could you let our listeners know where to find out more information about you and your resources?
Oh, okay. Sure. Survivors can go to saferelationshipsmagazine.com, and therapists can go to our site for training resources at survivortreatment.com.
Well, we have reached the end of our show today. And thank you so much, Sandra Brown, for joining us to talk about how to spot these pathological relationships, narcissistic abuse, and how to leave an abusive relationship. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And listeners, if you or someone you know is going through a divorce or is thinking about a divorce in the Northeast Florida area, please reach out to us at FloridaWomen'sLawGroup.com. You'll find the link in the episode description. And thank you for listening.